Excellent.
Wrong person.
No, you're one of the right people. There you go. There we are. This is perfect. There we go. You can just focus on Shell and I'd be
No, you could focus on Alex.
happy. Or both of us. There we go. Anyway, Shellen, do you want to start anything officially on the
Oh
recording?
yeah. So welcome to the final session, final lesson, I should say, of the MEA Bootcamp. We made it this far, which is really exciting, and it certainly won't stop. And let's enough from hearing from me. Let's begin.
Thank you very much, Shellen. And, for the last time, welcome. Sniff is very sad. It is, but also very happy because we've talked about so much together. There have been so many amazing questions, and it's really been lovely to get to see so many of you again week after week and come to know you this way. And hopefully for those of you who are here as well as for those who are watching the videos, you've learned a bit and understand a bit more now, and then also know where to come for questions or guidance or anything like that. So please always feel free to stay engaged far after this course ends soon. Let me share my screen. We'll see what kind of trouble I can get into sharing at this time if I have any troubles. I know that Jimena will tell me, so I appreciate that. And put it into proper presenter mode. And there we go. Excellent. Okay, good. See, I have learned as well. I have learned many technological things from this experience. So thank you all. So welcome back to our final week, Module 4, where we have the case study of the International Legally Binding Instrument on Plastic Pollution, including in the marine environment, under UNEA Resolution 514. And I should point out that, although unrelated to this discussion, I should point out that in this past several days since we last had our first meeting for Module 4, another treaty that was being negotiated and really subject to heavy debate was agreed to, and that is the Pandemic Treaty. Now, that is not under UNEA, that was under the World Health Organization. But I think anytime we have a new treaty agreed to, as you've seen from this process, it's quite long. From the discussions, it's quite long, it's quite intense. So I think a huge congratulations goes out to the WHO Secretariat, to all those who facilitated the treaty happening, and also the member states and the observers, etc., who participated, because it really is a very big accomplishment. And hopefully it will be a good omen for us as we go into all of this negotiation process that's coming up in the late spring into the summer, where we have the various COPs for Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, and then where we go into open-ended working groups for the Science Policy Panel, and then the Global Framework on Chemicals, and obviously, most critically for our discussion of this case study, INC 5.2 in August, which seemed so long ago, or not that long ago, to be so far away, but now it seems like it's quite close. So there we are. Now, we left off last time at our discussions of INC 2, and we finished off our discussions at the end of Paris. So we will continue on. We will go into INC 3 and then 4 and 5, and then a little preview of what may be in store for 5.2. And then obviously open up to your questions. So to remind you quite quickly, or if you missed the earlier session in the video or in person, we are talking about the INC process because we had an authorization from the UN Environment Assembly, from UNEA, in the early spring, late winter, depending on how you want to define it, of 2022, where the authorization was for the convening of ideally 5 rounds of negotiations between the end of 2022 and the end of 2024 to negotiate and agree on a treaty text to address plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. We saw this take off quite quickly, and we saw that by November of 2022, we had the first meeting of the INC in Punta del Este in Uruguay. And then we had the second meeting in Paris in May into June of 2023. And following that, we didn't have the authorization for intersessional work, but we did have obviously a great deal of work done by the Secretariat in that period between INC2 and INC3. And a reminder before we go any further with the acronyms that INC stands for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. Technically, this means only the member states that are part of the committee because they are the ones that will be agreeing to fully the treaty text, and they are the ones that will be legally bound by it under international law. Although the resolution itself, in Resolution 514, did quite clearly create a space and put an emphasis on the inclusion of observers and stakeholders and also transparency. So when we talk about the INC process, we talk about the formal convening of the member states to have a negotiation, but we also talk about including observers and stakeholders as participants as well. So just to remind everyone. So in the lead up to INC3, the INC Secretariat released what we called the zero draft. Now, reminding us of last week when we talked about the treaty negotiation process, the zero draft is essentially the first draft of a treaty text. We start off with the name zero in international law, but it is the first iteration of what might be in a treaty text. There is no intention that it will be the final text. It would be amazing if it was, but there usually is not that intention. And so what we saw from the zero draft that was prepared and presented was some sets of textual proposals. So in some areas, there were potential elements that could be included based on the discussions and negotiations that had happened at INC1 and especially INC2. And then we also saw a set of other topics that hadn't been discussed at the INCs yet, but that had either been raised in the INCs for potential inclusion or that were reflective of the actual parameters set out in the UNEA resolution itself. So the zero draft contained both placeholders for a future negotiation and then also potential kind of first steps in the drafting process of things that had already been discussed at INC2 and also as an opening matter at INC1. In addition, during the intersessional period, there was a questionnaire that was put out to member states and also to observers and stakeholders to gather more information that could be transmitted and used and discussed during to kind of prepare everyone for what positions might be going into the negotiations at INC3 and then also to be used during INC3. And the Secretariat very kindly kind of organized and synthesized all of this information. But that was then made available. Everything was made publicly available on the INC website, so people could go and look at different national filings and also observer and stakeholder filings. And some of you have asked kind of where there has been a potential for stakeholders and observers to propose text, since technically, obviously, they do not have that ability to do it on the floor or as part of the INC process itself. But what we did start to see was a number of different observers and stakeholders putting in their views on what potential text could look like, so that others, member states, and also other organizations could see it, take that under advisement and consideration, and then see whether or not it was something they might want to include in their proposals. So when we got to Nairobi in November of 2023, you will see the welcome sign to the UNEP headquarters compound in Nairobi, which is an amazing venue. We saw the third round of negotiations start. And the aims here, again, were to have more discussion of the topics that were already discussed at INC3. Obviously, pardon me, 2. And obviously, we know that INC2 was a bit shorter in actual negotiation time than we had planned. because it was much more focused on the rules of procedure aspects for many of the opening days. So we didn't have as much work done as we wanted. And there was a sense that we really needed to focus more during INC3 um, on what we had already talked about, and then also shifting into potential aspects for negotiation of the placeholder things in the zero draft itself. And the zero draft was used as the basis of negotiation and discussion where there was text that had already been proposed in the zero draft and articulated in the zero draft. And we built on from there. So obviously, when you start with a negotiating text, you start with that text, and then member states give their views. They also make proposals for adding things, taking things away, adding new sections. The use of brackets, which Shelland and I certainly have had a great deal of fun and exchange over recently, in terms of using bracketed text, et cetera, to indicate these types of suggestions for additions or deletions, being quite common at this point and continuing on throughout the rest of our lives in the INC process to this point. Someday I'll be able to do this and not have it be a problem. Now, just to point out quickly, what happened during the INC3 negotiation sessions, we did see a bit of criticism that was leveled about what the zero draft contained or whether or not it addressed all of the views that were made during the actual INC process themselves, as well as during the submissions processes that had been available in the intersessional periods between INC 1 and 2 and then 2 and 3. So we did see a bit of a challenge to some of the zero draft because of that. Again, this is not uncommon when you're trying to reconcile a number of views of a number of different states. There is always that potential for criticism, but it certainly was used as a very strong draft to be the basis of negotiation at INC3. And we saw again an increase in interest. So we saw states being present, certainly, and we also saw an increased number of delegates coming from observers and from non-member states, so stakeholders, et cetera, to participate in the INC3 negotiations. And I think this is a very important example to illustrate why it is often thought that we should, and we then do have rotating rounds of negotiations or conferences of the parties rather than having one dedicated place that we hold all of the negotiation sessions in or all of the COPs in. And what we saw in INC3 in Nairobi was the participation of a number of civil society groups from Africa, from the African region, who often, due to funding issues or due to the time it takes to secure visas, et cetera, are not able to or find it very challenging to travel to negotiations and COPs when they are, for example, in Europe or in North America, et cetera. But they were able to participate in the third round of the INC process and make their voices heard and bring their constituents in, especially the waste pickers in particular, were very well organized and very much important participation members in this round. So I think that Nairobi can show us many things, including the importance of rotating so that every geographic region can have the ability to really bring in different stakeholders and observers that are potentially affected by whatever is being discussed, but might not have the ability to be present in all of the negotiation rounds. And certainly as the third negotiating session, and so the midpoint of the scheduled negotiating sessions, this was a critical point to bring in those voices. The outcome from INC3 had several different prongs. So first of all, there was an effort to have intersessional work authorized. It was one of the things that kind of got held until late in the discussion period, in the sense of up until the very end, there were efforts to have agreement on this. But unfortunately, there was no consensus that could be reached. So there was no authorization for formal intersessional work. Obviously, governments worked on this in between the rounds, and there were governments that worked together and did have a number of different events and fact-finding reports and other forms of co-working, but this was not formal. And the other outcomes included the authorization and the request to the Secretariat to create a revised zero draft. So again, not in terminology, not a first draft. If you're writing a paper, for example, you think about writing a first draft, but here we start with the zero draft. And then the request was for a revised zero draft that would take into account everything that was done and said and suggested in the INC3 meetings, both in terms of potential changes to the existing text of the zero draft and also potential new additions to elements of the zero draft, which had been just held open under the iteration of the zero draft itself. And so we had the articulation of the revised zero draft, which was approximately 70 pages with many brackets. And so it did take even those of us with legal training a long time to sit there and try to map out, okay, so if we do this, then this and this. It was like a great puzzle. It was. I enjoy a good jigsaw puzzle. There's actually one over here that my partner and I just completed. But it was like a puzzle to try to put together, but many of us did. And so the revised zero draft is what took us into Ottawa in April of 2024 for INC4. Here you will see a lovely view of Ottawa by day. You'll see it by night as well, the Shaw Center, which many of us just that was our view of Ottawa. Anyway, the aims of this negotiation round were really to start coming towards agreement on as much text as possible, and then filling in the areas that may have been held open and may have still had placeholders used largely for them in the revised zero draft, and to get momentum moving as much as possible towards INC5 and towards having a conclusion of the negotiation process during INC5. So we were in Ottawa in Canada, the capital of Canada, for this round, and we had a number of different topics on the agenda. We use the same, this is Ottawa by night, by the way. We use the same structure as we have used in the other INC processes in terms of having the plenaries open and close and also a mid-session plenary, and then breaking into contact groups and also subcontact groups. So within an umbrella of what one contact group was discussing, for example, financing, having a smaller subgroup that looked at financial mechanisms, etc., to really get to the core issues of those topics and negotiate those topics that were considered to be linchpin pivotal elements. This was a very intense process. It was at times somewhat contentious in terms of arguments forward and backward. And what we saw really was this beginning of a focus on certain topics as being really critical to defining what the rest of the treaty would be and what the future of the treaty looks like. So we saw that the opening core control measures, so the things that would be potentially the binding elements of the treaty, the most legally enforceable elements of the treaty, were very much up for debate, and that there are different views on them. So, for example, the inclusion of chemicals of concern, primary plastic polymers or secondary plastic polymers, plastic products, and also product design as one kind of core thing to look at. And then also the understanding of financial mechanisms, capacity building, technology transfer, and what those dichotomies might look like for developing states, for developed states, for states with particular concerns in relation to plastic pollution, especially small island developing states. And finally, questions of governance. So what would be the governance systems that would be used. Obviously, we tend to have a number of different examples coming, or similar, but from different avenues, examples coming to us from other MEAs. The standard pattern involves a secretariat that is dedicated for the particular treaty, and then the convening of a conference of the parties as a governance structure itself, and then potentially other sub-entities within that. So various committees or standing committees, standing entities, etc., that could be used. So we saw these as some of the major areas of debate. Um, we did not get to any agreement on any text. We also did not get to any agreement on the formalization of any type of proposal. So we winnowing it down from a number of different options to one or two. We didn't quite get to that for many of the core elements that were up for debate. And so as a result, we had three main authorizations and three main outcomes coming from INC4. The first was actually to have the first set of intersessional work conducted between INC4 and INC5. And the agreement on this was that it would be intersessional work that would focus on two topic areas. So the first being the combination of how we might think about, because the intersessional work is not a negotiation process. It is a convening of member states and experts, et cetera, to try to really discuss and perhaps come up with definitions or suggestions for how to move forward on certain key critical areas. So we had one cluster that was intended to look at chemicals of concern, plastic products, and product design. And then the other cluster that was intended to look at financing and capacity building, et cetera. So those were the two authorized streams of work. With the idea that this would be potentially online, potentially in person, but that it would also include experts from member states. So the participation was to try to really have a concerted conversation of experts and member state views. It was limited in the sense that the authorization was for member states and their experts in related fields to be present and to be involved in the work of the intersessional period, not open as an INC would be to the entirety of eligible stakeholders and observers, et cetera. Now, this did obviously raise a number of questions and a number of concerns regarding transparency from various observers and stakeholders. However, again, this is not necessarily uncommon to how an intersessional period would work, and authorized work would be conducted, particularly when we think about the timing and the time frame and the pressure that was there. So that was one outcome. The other outcomes included the authorization for the creation before INC5, with the idea that it would start work at INC5, of a legal drafting group, so known as an LDC, or probably LDG, not LDC, LDG. And the LDG, of which I should remember, I should point out I was a member and continue to be a member for Guinea-Bissau, was designated as something where each member state could nominate its own expert or experts who are legal experts, so have legal expertise, to sit on a committee that would get, when there was a textual proposal, or perhaps there were two textual proposals that might come from one of the contact groups to the plenary, and then the plenary would forward to the legal drafting group. We would then sit there and look at the text to see if there are any legal challenges, legal inconsistencies, if something is against international law, or if it would create inconsistencies within the treaty text itself. So, for example, if a reporting requirement was referenced in Article 2 and it said something about reporting shall be filed every 5 years, And then the national reporting requirements in another article, hypothetically, Article 10, not really, but hypothetically, said something about national reports being filed every 3 years, that would be an internal inconsistency. And it would make the application of the treaty quite difficult because would then be questions. Which one takes priority? Which one do we follow, etc. So the work of the legal drafting group in that sense sounds very exotic. It is to those of us who are legal experts and love looking at aspects of the law. But for many of the rest of the world, the sane world, it is a thing that is a bit dry in the sense that we're looking just to make sure that textually there aren't any problems as a matter of law. It was not intended to be something that would look and say, yes, this is a good idea. Yes, this is a bad idea. There's no kind of value judgment allowed. It really is just looking at it from a technical perspective. So that was authorized, leading to the process in the intersessional period of countries nominating their experts and having them be confirmed, et cetera, so that they could work for INC 5. And then the other step was the specific request and authorization to the Secretariat to create a compilation document, which would be a compilation of the revised zero draft and then work that was done, or suggestions that were made, both verbally and also in written form during the INC4 process, so that that would then be used, at least at this point, would be used as the negotiation basis for INC 5. And that document was released by the Secretariat in the summer months, so prior to the intersessional work, which we'll get to momentarily. It was released by the Secretariat. It was longer than actually the revised zero draft, which I'm going to give you a bit of foreshadowing here, which did raise concerns from a number of countries that it would be very difficult to take what was, including the opening pages, et cetera, 77 pages of a compilation document and refine it into a treaty text during INC 5. So I leave it there. We'll pick up on that momentarily, but that was kind of where we were going into the intersessional period and leaving Ottawa. So we left Ottawa and then we went to Bangkok, which was a lot warmer. Of course, it was also August, but it was a lot warmer. So, as I mentioned, the intersessional work was authorized around two topics. One, looking at financing, especially the financial mechanism, capacity building, etc. The other looking at potential definitions and parameters based on science, as well as including words from potentially from legal experts, such as myself, for chemicals of concern, plastic products, and plastic product design. These were deemed to be ad hoc, open-ended expert groups. So they, again, were not negotiating. We were not negotiating. We were there to provide information, expertise, and see perhaps where we might be able to find some areas of coalescence or cohesion around these different topics. And again, this was a designated national expert process alone. There were a number of sessions that were held prior to our in-person meeting. So as was authorized and envisioned in Ottawa, we had online sessions. And so there were 3 per group, so 6 overall, that were held online during July and August. They were chaired, as was the in-person session, by the various co-chairs of the contact groups for the various INCs, and very much reflected the way that those co-chairs had run their particular subgroup and contact groups throughout the INC process. During the online sessions, everyone had the opportunity to speak on various issues, and the co-chairs guided us through the various issues. They also, in some instances, used questionnaires, which were kindly facilitated by the Secretariat, so that we were able to provide written suggestions, written comments, and also examples of other tools that we might know of, for example, definitions that were used for chemicals or product design, etc., so that when we got to the actual in-person session, many of us would then have the ability to share and understand the viewpoints that others are coming from, and also the scientific and technical information that other delegations were perhaps using when they were talking about these types of issues. So it was very helpful. It was very useful. We met in Bangkok at the UN offices in Bangkok. You will see here one of my lunchtime strolls resulted in this photo, which is in the gardens in the Bangkok offices, which are beautiful and lovely and very tranquil in the middle of all of this work. Um, we had a week-long meeting, and it was very clear coming out of that meeting that there were still very strong divides between countries, especially in the context of how we regulate and what we regulate with this treaty, how we would define chemicals of concern, but also if they should be included in the treaty, or if they are considered to be sufficiently addressed by other treaties so we wouldn't need to or shouldn't legally, whether we should have product design, and also whether we should include plastic products themselves and how we would define those. These were all very deeply contentious issues that were not able to really be bridged much in the intersessional work process. In the financing mechanism and capacity building, et cetera, discussions, the focus really was on the idea of financial mechanisms first and foremost. And we did see kind of the divide coming down to the 2 points, which we've talked about before and which we'll talk about again, in terms of the agreement that, yes, there needs to be a financial mechanism for implementing this particular treaty, especially for developing states that are seeking to be member states and implement it. But the question is, where do we host this fund and who is hosting it? Is it something that will be like the Montreal Protocol, where it is funded as a separate entity? It's a standalone entity that reports to the COP, but it's its own entity. Or will it be something that, again, reports to the COP, but is housed in and administered by, for example, the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank, where it is an already established international entity and organization that has existing rules and structures, and also existing offices and secretariats, et cetera, to put into place and operationalize the particular terms of the treaty and the financing mechanism. That is something that very clearly emerged coming out of the intersessional work as a debate, and it's something that continues to be a debate even now. So, in an effort to move things along, and in an effort to try to meet the requirements of the UNEA Resolution 514 in terms of the ambition of concluding by the end of 2024 a treaty text, the chair of the INC decided to hold informal consultations and dialogues with the heads of a number of national delegations, as well as with other key stakeholders, et cetera, in an idea of trying to find a way forward. And so he had come up with several different iterations of what was called a non-paper, the chair's non-paper. The final one, the third version, was publicly released in November of 2024 before INC 5 as a suggestion for how we might move negotiations forward, and as a suggestion for an alternate text that might be used as the basis for negotiation in INC 5. Again, we had the compilation document, which was authorized and requested by the INC itself from the Secretariat. And the reason that we call the chair's non-paper the chair's non-paper, it is a paper. So the non-paper nomenclature is a little bit difficult, but the reason we use this nomenclature is that technically this was something that the chair, in his capacity as chair, decided to do on his own, of his own accord. So technically, the INC did not ask him to do this, did not authorize him to do this. Certainly, it was within the scope of his actual chairmanship, but it was not something that was specifically requested by the INC. So it couldn't be called something formal in that way. And hence it's called a non-paper because it is technically not legally under the auspices of having been created or requested by the INC. But the non-paper was there as well. And then when we got to the actual INC 5 meeting itself in Busan, in the Republic of Korea, in November into very early December, we had actually a debate, which took a bit of a time, between countries as to what document to use as the basis for negotiations. Should we use the compilation document? Should we use the chair's non-paper? And ultimately, the decision was made to use the chair's non-paper, but with the express agreement and proviso that every country, as is its sovereign right, as a member of the INC, could propose something that was in the compilation document, be brought back into the chair's non-paper, and could also propose other things that were not in the compilation document or the non-paper moving forward. So making clear that this was very much a base level for the negotiations, but that nothing was being foreclosed by choosing one over the other. Um, and again, the aims for this negotiation round really were to try to have a treaty concluded by the end. It was a slightly longer round in the sense that it was 7 calendar days, so it was a bit longer than we had been having of the 5 days. And the idea was that we really try to spend as much time as possible working and coming up with texts that could be agreed on at the end. And I show you a view of Busan and the welcome center, or the welcome and badging center outside of Bexco, which is where we were, the name of the convention center where we were. I wish my translation says outside of Mexico. I wish it was, but no, it was outside of Bexco, BEXCO, which was in the Republic of South Korea, or Republic of Korea. I wanted you to see the view that many of us had of the evening, which was this as we left. Um, and the daytime, it tended to look more like this, so lovely blue sky, etc. Now, we all had a great deal of focus during INC 5, and there really was an effort to make as much progress as possible. The issues continued in terms of having the very clear divides on chemicals of concern, on product design, on how we define plastics and what plastics are actually being regulated, as well as a really integral and internal discussion about what are we regulating with this treaty? Are we regulating potentially the full life cycle, which is in the ask and the terms of the UNEA resolution of Resolution 514? Or are we seeking to regulate more along the downstream, the waste management elements? Because this really has become a much clearer divide between a number of states. Estimated to be over 100 of the states participating in this process, who want it to be a life cycle treaty, so want it to be everything from the production phase to the consumption phase to the final downstream waste management end of life product of the product phase. And a smaller minority, but still a core group that wants it to be very much focused more on the waste management aspects of plastic pollution. And this has been quite clear as a point of contention. The other point of contentions have really focused around what are we including in terms of product design and plastic pollution itself, and also chemicals of concern, and again, the financing issues. So the financing issues in terms of what are we setting up? Are we setting up a standalone fund? Are we setting up something within the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank, et cetera, have continued to predominate the discussions on the whole concept of financing and capacity building and technology transfer, et cetera. When we left off at the end of the negotiations, the primary split, as reflected by the proposals that have been put in, was on the one hand the GRULAC, so Latin America and the Caribbean, African regional group of negotiators, and many of the small island developing states and the PCIDs, the Pacific Island, small island developing states. together putting in a proposal for a standalone fund that would be its own entity, a new entity that would be overseen and governed by the COP versus the predominantly Western European and other group, including the Nordic funders, et cetera, and the EU that really want this to be something that exists, but exists based in the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank or an existing entity. And there are a number of really interesting elements for both of these and arguments for both of these. I think it's something we could easily do like a follow-up discussion on, and maybe even something, Sheldon, to think about for some of the youth webinars. But it is something that is a dichotomy that still exists. And we saw throughout the negotiations the chair trying to issue several different non-papers that could be used as a basis for a negotiation. Moving forward and advancing the negotiation forward in order to find a resolution and have a treaty delivered at the end of the INC 5 meetings. So with that in mind, we saw two non-papers issued, one on the 29th of November, and then one on the final day of the negotiations on the 1st of December. And ultimately, we couldn't have agreements on treaty text. The legal drafting group did indeed meet for an initial kind of introductory meeting, but we didn't have any text to look at to clean. So we, from that perspective, my job was very easy. But what we had was the agreement at quite late or quite early, depending on how you look at it, hour of the day or evening, to adjourn the meeting. So not to close the meeting, but to adjourn the meeting to a later time and a later date, where hopefully we will then have a final negotiation to give us a treaty and to have agreement on a treaty. There was no authorization at the end of INC 5 for intercessional work. So there will be no formal intercessional work concluded, although a number or conducted and concluded, although a number of states are trying to work together to find solutions so that when we come into the INC 5.2 meeting, we have a bit more of a coherence between many states, and there are their own kind of state-driven ideas that are reflected from the outset. We will see how that goes. It certainly is a number of different clusters trying to do this. I mentioned this before, but just to highlight again, why do we call it 5.2? How are we able to have another session when the resolution from UNEA envisioned only 5 sessions? The UNEA resolution authorized technically the 5 sessions. But when we go from one to the other, we have to gavel the chair, whoever is the chair has to officially gavel one concluded. So for example, INC 1 was gavelled closed, and then that allowed us to have INC 2. The option to keep something open when we're not quite finished with it, but we need to keep doing more at a later date, is instead for the chair to use the gavel, but to say that the meeting is adjourned rather than closed. And by adjourning the meeting, then you're able to carry it over to another meeting, which is then considered to be a point two. And if there are subsequent meetings, I'm not saying there would ever be, but if there were to be, and other treaty processes could have this as well, then you would have a point whatever to indicate that you're going into multiple meeting sessions, but all of that same overall round. So that's why we're calling it INC 5.2, because it is still the active open INC 5, but just a resumed session. And it can get a little bit confusing because technically the UNEA resolution 514 was adopted at the continued session of UNEA 5, so 5.2. So it also gets a little tricky at a certain point. Anyway, so coming out of Busan, we knew that we would be meeting again. We didn't exactly know when or where, but we knew we would be meeting again. And so now we are very clear that we are going to be in the lovely city of Geneva. There's a photo of the iconic Jet L'eau on Lake Geneva. We are going to be there officially from the 4th to the 15th of August in Geneva. I'm sure many of us, including myself, will be there a wee bit earlier at the Palais des Nations. So lovely compound in Geneva. And we will be again trying to conclude the treaty and using one of the chair's non-papers, presumably as the basis for negotiations moving forward. Again, nothing will be off the table in the sense that because we are saying we will use one of the chair's non-papers, we are not saying we preclude the introduction of new text or potential text. Every member state certainly will continue to have that right because they are sovereign entities and they are members of the INC. In terms of participation, we are assuming, and everything that we have been told thus far indicates that certainly stakeholders and observers will be able to participate. I should mention that there were some issues in Busan that did come up in terms of accessibility of rooms of negotiations for observers and stakeholders, so for non-member states. In the beginning, we had a number of issues because of some of the sizes of the rooms and the number of people who wanted to be in. So there was a restriction. And if you didn't have a national delegation badge, you had to basically queue up, wait in a queue, wait in a line, and then as people would come in and go out, you would be able to come in and go out. And certainly there were some sessions that were closed, especially towards the end of the negotiating round, um, to observers and stakeholders. So there was a bit of a pushback from some aspects of the stakeholder and observer constituency on this and on the transparency element, especially since it was included in their arguments in UNEA Resolution 514 itself. But what we know is that both the member states and observers and stakeholders will be able to participate in INC 5.2. Um, and we anticipate that we will have a treaty. The challenges obviously are still trying to bridge a number of different, very divergent views on very core aspects of what should go into this treaty in a short period of time, although this is the longest time we've had for negotiations. So hopefully it really does allow us to have a bit more of a fruitful discussion and dialogue and keep a momentum going to actually have a treaty outcome. Um, and I should say it is, challenging because I know many people have also kind of viewed August as a summer holiday month. But we will all be there and we will all be working very hard. I know that CYMG will be there working very hard to advocate for its constituency. And then we will see. We will see what the outcomes are. Um, and just as a reminder, as a summary, because it's our final session, so I didn't want to go way over. What did we do this week? We learned to apply the lessons of the past 3 weeks to an actual case study that is evolving, that is live and ongoing. We learned to understand the main issues and policies, including my issue of my spell check, and procedures that are used in the context of the negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty, also known as the ILBI. And also we learned to explore how various forms of constituencies can be involved or are already involved in the Global Plastics Treaty negotiation process. And with that, all I can do is say a very, very heartfelt, massive thank you to all of you. It has really been a pleasure. I am happy to take questions and also just to ask you to please stay in touch. Please always feel free to reach out with questions, email, WhatsApp, anything that you'd like. Um, but really, thank you all. This has been so much fun. Truly, so much fun. And a huge thank you to CYMG, especially to Shellen and Jimena, Aish, who's I don't think on this call, Samuel, 50, all of you, you are incredible. And I really have loved working with you. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing now because I finally figured out how to do this well. Anyway. There we go. God, I'm looking at myself. Anyway.
I will add myself to the spotlight, since we've
Oh, thank
okayed
you
it,
very
but
much.
we can hit it together.
See, there we go. This is just what you will see at any like INC. You will see the two of us sitting there together, often with coffees or sharing chocolate. So
Yes.
that.
I think as I as many know, I think half my suitcase last time was just like filled with snacks from the United States, which
It was. I saw it.
yeah,
It was.
yeah, it was Trader Joe's, um the healthy our like healthy store here, which Busan had them too, but it's like when you get so tired and everything, you're just like, I want stuff from home.
Yes. Or you're me and you just scavenged all the local chocolate shops.
Yes.
Anyway. And we were
Okay.
lucky in Busan, there was one across the street. So,
Yes. Oh, and we were across the street from one of the largest hotel, no, not hotels, malls in the world.
malls. Yes.
Yes, quite random. Quite random.
Quite useful.
Um,
Anyway,
I guess the big question, this is a great question to start off with, and this is kind of the elephant in the room, is INC 5.2 supposed to be the last?
it is supposed to be the last.
We hope.
And as much as we all love seeing each other, we all hope it is the last so that we can have a treaty and then go into the process of ratifying the treaty and implementing it and seeing each other again at the diplomatic conference and the conference of the parties. It is supposed to be. Will it be? I don't know. I do not have a crystal
Yeah.
ball. But just as a reminder, when we do have the treaty, it's then we will all be very happy. We will all collapse. You know, when we wake up, we will be happy. But then it still has to go through the process of going back to every country. Well, first of all, it has to go through a diplomatic conference. So we have to have a formal conference where very high level people, presidents, prime ministers, or very high ranking ministers come and they sign on behalf of their country. And so they say, we commit to being part of this, at least in principle. And then this is wonderful, but then everything has to go back home to every country and through whatever process exists in their constitutional structure be ratified. So in some cases, it has to be introduced through parliament and it has to go through multiple houses of parliament. In some cases, it has to go through only one house. In some cases, for example, some constitutional monarchies, it has to start. And in the monarch's official offering and declaration of trying to have it passed, and then it goes through phases. And then once we hit whatever the number of countries we need for the treaty to ratify, to go into effect, uh, then we will trigger a time clock that starts to have the first conference of the parties. So it's still going to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of, for many of us who are working on this, kind of assisting countries with figuring out how to ratify it, and then with the ratification process. So if the idea is, it would be great if we could get a treaty soon so we could then start the rest of the processes. Um, Super long answer, but anyway.
Yes, because I think as a lot of us have talked about, getting a treaty will be the easiest part.
In many ways,
Implementation
yes.
will
It's
be harder, and ratification.
getting a treaty is like getting to the starting line of any sports hypothetical you want to put in. Then we have to go. Yes.
Next question, which is, I mean, as I keep saying, they're all great questions. What is the difference in practical impact of the informal or formal intercessional work? How does the potential impact change if the work is not formally authorized? Fantastic question.
Such a great question. So the formal authorization means that everyone has the right to be there, has the ability to come depending on who's authorized to be in the room, they can also have experts, etc. It also means that in terms of just assistance and support, Typically, UNEP will provide some type of funding and assistance for member countries to have at least one person there present. It will be held at a designated facility that is coordinated by the UNEP's secretariat, by the INC secretariat at this point, and will have the official assistance of the INC secretariat, who will facilitate all the planning and then all of the actual on the ground work. Um, and so that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect is that whatever comes out will not be a treaty negotiation result, but will be a reflective document that will be then offered at the INC next INC meeting and throughout the process to have a formal statement of what countries kind of talked about, what areas they maybe found some coherence on or convergence on, and then where the faults were as well. So this all becomes a very official level document and contribution. At the same time, when we think about the informal processes, they're often much smaller. They're often countries that perhaps have something in common or that have differences, and so they're trying to work them out amongst themselves. So it's a smaller group. It can be very effective. It absolutely can be very, very effective, but the results won't be official. They might result in, for example, the offering of a joint proposal during the INC or the offering of a joint conference room paper or something like that. But they won't be an official document read into the report and into the process. And then also when you're looking at just the practicalities of getting to these types of informal meetings, UNEP support obviously doesn't cover this. So the question is, how do we kind of get countries to go to these types of meetings, etc. The informal work also is often criticized, rightly or wrongly, because in many ways it is not as transparent. It is not as transparent, it is not as open. Observers and stakeholders typically do not have as much of a role there as they may in intercessional work. So there is a balance to be had, I think, in intercessional and formal and informal work. Um, and just before I stop speaking and get to the next question, I don't know if she's still online, but I saw that Jimena is about to leave. So Jimena, if you're still online, a huge thank you. Thank you very much. And if not, um, I'll send you a message just to make sure.
And carry on, this is actually part of another part
Hmm.
is can you say a bit more about the main interesting arguments of either side of the split from INC 5 about having a standalone entity versus existing structure, and also in terms of life cycle management versus waste management focus?
Absolutely. So for the financing mechanisms, um, there are really kind of two core considerations. The one core consideration is that many countries, especially many developing countries, have had very public criticisms of the existing financial bodies. So especially the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, for the speed at which they make decisions, the implementation, often some aspects of the oversight, some aspects of the managerial policies. And they often argue that this is considered, in many instances, to be functionally kind of holding them back, or that it is in many ways kind of putting too many controls on them. The counter argument to that is that in order to secure the interests of the donor countries, because it's typically a country uh, donor system for these types of entities, although there is also a discussion about how we might do this in a way that includes private financing or blended financing. But for especially the strictly public financing, there is a concern that if we don't have the types of policies, the gender policies, the indigenous community policies, the environmental impact assessment policies, all of these things that are in place in the Jeff and the World Bank context, it is very difficult for donors to feel comfortable making large donations to a fund because they don't know that those types of guarantees are there. They don't know how they'll be enforced. And they also have constituencies to report to. They have countries and taxpayers to report to. So it can be a bit more difficult. Natasha, I just saw a point here that I think links in really well. Yes, there are many learnings that we can have from the Montreal Protocol process. And the Montreal Protocol process is actually the one that those who are arguing for a standalone fund typically point to, because the Montreal Protocol has its own fund. The Montreal Protocol, again, came out of the Vienna Convention on relating to ozone depletion. And the Montreal Protocol Fund has been in existence for several decades now. And it is its own standalone entity. Um, the thing to remember about the Montreal Protocol financing element is that it actually was not authorized in the Montreal Protocol itself. As such, there was a space that was given for potential things like financing in the treaty, but it was not actually created in the treaty. And as a result, we had to wait until several COP cycles before it finally was authorized and then went into effect. So the treaty would, if we are looking at a separate standalone entity, the treaty would really need to provide as much guidance as possible from the outset to make it operational. And even then, it is a very questionable thing in terms of quickness and responsiveness, because you would have to create an entire governance structure to put it in place and at least have policies that are similar to things like the Jeff uses or the World Bank, so that donors would feel comfortable. And this is where a lot of the argument really starts to come into tension. And I will just say also, with the timing aspect of it, what we've seen in operational functions from the Jeff is that although the BB&J process itself, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, hasn't officially started yet because it hasn't hit that number of ratifications yet needed. The Jeff has been able to operationalize some of its funding to provide assistance to states in the ratification process. So that is an example of something which would be very difficult to do if you have a standalone fund, because you need the treaty to actually come into existence before the fund can, in many instances, start working. Um, so those are some of the pros and the cons and the tensions. In terms of waste management versus life cycle, it really is often focused on kind of what the national priorities are. Um, for many of the very big producing states, we have heard, petroleum producing states in particular, we have heard arguments that this should really just be a waste management issue, that it should just be something where we're trying to figure out what to do with products at the end of their life cycle, and not try to do the full life cycle. But what we hear from a number of different states, especially those that are actually receiving the waste, the plastic waste, is that they want it to be an entire life cycle treaty, as was authorized under UNEA Resolution 514, because what we saw there was this focus on the need to change fundamentally the way that plastics are produced. Also, the need for accountability in terms of what public disclosures are required for what is in plastic products. And a number of countries, including some of those that I work with quite closely, constantly remind us that they have to clean their beaches of marine-based plastic waste, but they don't know what is in it. And so they often have waste pickers or even volunteers who go and do beach cleans, who are potentially exposed to a number of different chemicals, some of which may require much more safety precaution in handling, but they don't know what those chemicals are because they don't know what is in the products that are washing up on their shores. So without that type of change from the production level onwards, it will be very difficult for them to then actually handle plastic pollution. So we tend to see those tensions really coming into place in terms of what are we doing with this treaty? How are we looking at plastic pollution? Is it only what happens once an object is used, or is it from the beginning of its life? I think that's the best way to think about that treaty argument. And just because I said, Gaetan, I saw it quickly and I mentioned BB&J. BB&J is indeed one of the discussion themes of UNOC 3. So if you are going to UNOC 3, you will be hearing a lot about BB&J.
Awesome. Next question. I think you've worked on this topic as well as there's some stories about this question as
Oh
well.
dear.
Do language barriers ever get in the way? Are translators present during the treaty negotiations? And we definitely have some stories about that.
Oh, so many stories. So yes, there are translators. Yes, language can become an issue. There are six official languages of the United Nations. So those languages are, again, Arabic, Chinese, English, Russian, Spanish, and what did I forget? Arabic, Russian, English, French. French.
French.
I forget my second language. There you go. Good job.
Oh, yes.
Really good job. Anyway, so those are the official languages. This means that all the documents that are produced officially will be translated. They're released first in English. So, for example, the compilation document was released first in English, and then all of the other translations were done. This also affects the timing of the calendar for when things are released. During the plenaries, so during the opening plenary, the closing plenary, any plenaries that happen in between, there is full translation. So what happens is you sit down, no matter where your seat is, there's a headset that is next to you, and you take the headset, you put it on. For me, it takes you ages to figure out the channel and takes you ages to figure out the buttons and everything. But when you do, then you get to listen to the translation, which may or may not be on time because of technical issues and may or may not have all sorts of other questions, but it's there. The problem, yes, Gaetan, I do speak French. The problem is that when we go into the contact groups or the subgroups, the working language is English and only English, and there is no translation. So if you are coming from a country that is not an English speaking country and you are not necessarily well trained or comfortable in English, or you're comfortable to get around a city in English as a tourist, but not to have a high level discussion, um, there is a problem. There is a barrier. And we know this is an issue. We've seen it be an issue. And unfortunately, it continues to be that way. It is not only in this negotiation, it is the standard practice throughout the UN system that this is what happens. I should also point out that there are other issues that exist for countries that don't speak as their primary language one of the six UN languages. So, for example, amongst the countries that I advise quite closely, I have several Portuguese speaking countries. Um, They may speak Spanish, they may speak French, they may speak some English, but their native language and the language that they are most comfortable in and know how to express things best in, including their own legal and regulatory processes, is Portuguese. So trying to figure out how to help them to bridge the linguistic barrier is very difficult. Now, obviously, it is impossible to have translation services available in all languages of the world. But it certainly is something to take into consideration when we are kind of thinking about participation and gaps and potential ways that there are gaps that we don't even think about as much. Language is a huge issue.
Yes. And I think even INC3, the translators went home early, and that simple thing was a big issue
It was.
as well.
The other issue tends to be that the translators are only available for a certain number of hours. Obviously, if you've ever done translation, even in your head, it can be very difficult. But when you're doing it at a professional high level and you're getting comments and don't have a script, so you don't really know what's coming, it takes a great toll. So the translators tend to have shorter hours sometimes, or set hours, and they can't really go beyond that because they can't, they're at capacity. So if a plenary goes far over, sometimes either we have to make a decision to stop the plenary because we don't have translation available, or a decision to continue on but only have it be done in English. And neither of these are really ideal situations.
Next question. I think this is one more about CYMG, but how best can CYMG members from developing countries contribute to the negotiations before the INC 5.2 and even after, no matter what the Geneva outcome is.
I'm going to leave that to you first. I mean, all I'm going to say is please, please, voices, please bring
Yes,
your voices, please, but tell it.
we want your voices. There are several different initiatives we have going on, and I will send them out in email and group chat after. We have the Global Youth Survey that is being led by Dr. Babette de Groot, who is a youth who's been very involved in this process, and she's also a part of CYMG. We also have youth consultations. So we're going to have, I think, 4 starting where you can contribute and give your voices. And really, it's you're helping make the positions for what we're going to tell member states and argue for at Inc. 5.2. As well as we understand accessibility might be an issue. So we'll also have a Google Doc, or not a Google Doc, a Google form. So our goal is to make it accessible to as many youth as possible to get their feedback on what they'd like to see in the treaty so we can develop our positions based off of not what, for example, you and I think, but what really the majority of the youth
Mhm.
think as well. And I can't talk a lot about this at the moment, but we are actually going to have, so CYMG is the official youth constituency for the UN Environmental Program. However, individual treaties such as the UNFCCC process and the Biodiversity Convention have its own youth constituencies. And we're actually in the process of giving the Plastics Treaty its own youth constituency. I am currently the interim chair. I can't speak a lot about it, but it will be but it will be a way for youth and young people to engage in the plastics treaty and in plastics, which is really exciting. And we're really excited about it. It's been about a year in the making right now. So hopefully we will launch it at Inc. 5.2 and share more information when it comes. But that will allow us to even work on more people to get involved and work on this plastic topic more extensively. Yes, and Gatan, it's actually GYBN was one of the inspirations for it. So I definitely want to talk to you about it at some point because building an entire new youth network or constituency, even though there's about 30 of us working on this right now, is a lot of work. So stay tuned for that. Um, as I'm trying to think of anything else, we'll also have debriefs, webinars, really I apologize if I don't get back to your messages right away. I currently have 54 unread messages. And we're all volunteers. And I'm also looking for a full-time job with this. So definitely reach out to us. I'll try to get back, but we're also always open to new ideas and suggestions as well. Like as I tell the own team that it's really a team effort and a decentralized effort. It's not one leader, and they definitely know that. Hence, we're all taking on leadership roles here. So, anything else to add, Alex?
I'm just excited. I'm excited for formal announcements and to see things grow and see the progress.
You know a lot. You know a lot.
I do. I don't know. I'm like the
You're
ant conversation.
yes. She's my mentor. She really is. I will say that.
And
Um,
I'm lucky for that. Yeah.
another question, and this is another great
Yeah.
question here, and definitely I will say personally, my view on this has changed quite a bit since the treaty negotiations have started. At this point, private companies will have far more implications because they have to reduce production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to sustainable levels. But then, how do we make sure it is respected and they are held accountable for their inaction? And the business coalition is, I think, I would surprise a lot of people. Let's just put it that way.
Yes. Because the business coalition tends to realize and tends to really kind of advocate for the fact that they will change. They have to change. It's not only in the plastics context, it's also in the climate context, biodiversity, everything linking together. So yeah, I think that is one of the most surprising things is that there's really a push from a lot of aspects in business to have a strong treaty and to move forward with implementing it so that it can actually be a tool to say we have to do this. So we're going to do it, and we're going to do it this way, and we're going to advocate for a treaty because we know we have to do it. Um, that said, in terms of how do we kind of enforce this, again, because only member states will sign, because states are the ones that are technically bound by international law, it becomes important for the states themselves to then not only sign it and ratify it, but put it into place and mainstream it throughout all of their different legal policies and requirements, especially for thinking of multinational corporations, for the home states of the multinationals to put this in place in their laws on reporting, on corporate social responsibility. Also, when we think about some responsibility that many countries have for the overseas actions and activities of their corporate actors. So not being able to do something or produce something, for example, um, in a country that is outside of the jurisdiction that you couldn't do at home, is something that we've seen often in the human rights context. So, for example, using child labor, etc. But it's also something that can be extended for environmental damage, environmental harm, and creating products that can't be, for example, sold in the EU market, not putting them on the market in other places as well. So there are a number of different examples that we could learn from, and that countries need to then think about kind of mainstreaming at home.
Yes, and I think one important thing to add is that the business coalition's really argument here is that they need global rules to make progress, that they've tried, and that it ended up at the end of the day, unfortunately, they do have to make, well, not unfortunately. I mean, the reality is they have to make profit, but they have tried to do these alternatives and it's costing them way more money than what's sustainable. So that's their really big argument. I think it changes your perspective when they want regulation, they want global rules. We saw
Yeah,
that recently again with the EU omnibus, where the EU has tried to basically deregulate sustainability disclosures. And in fact, a lot of the companies came out against deregulation. So it's definitely a very interesting perspective and one that you don't really necessarily understand until you get into the thick of it, I guess.
no, absolutely. And I think also it's important to remember that in many instances, the business coalition and the groups that it represents, they, even if they're looking at something that says it might give us more regulations to follow or more restrictions, if they know, and especially if they know uniformly, so if it's a global treaty that has global standards, then they can anticipate how to handle it. They can put measures in place. They can do risk reduction and do all of these different things. Um, it's if it's segmented or if it's left open and it's a very broad treaty that doesn't have clear guidelines, etc. That's where it becomes a problem because then they don't know how to put it in place, or they don't have the reassurance that we put this in place and our competitors have to as well. So if we put it into place, we won't be undercutting ourselves or taking on an extra financial burden, etc. Because we're located in one country, but our competitors are located in another, and their country hasn't decided to take on the same rules. So there really is a sense of kind of very pragmatic understanding as to how it will work and the need to just have certainty moving forward.
And I would say one thing that I think people don't talk about enough is that their public image. Certainly companies, even member states are definitely aware of their public image and what people think of them, and how also more than ever the environmental footprint impacts, the consumer's point of view, as well as, that's why even sending letters, voicing your opinion is so important, because if anything I've learned in this process, I think a lot of youth have learned in this process, they do pay attention, even though they may not see. I mean, we've had plenty of meetings with member states, in particular, example is the United States, and they'll talk about how they received this letter or they heard from this person. So they definitely notice, if that makes sense, even though they're
Mhm.
these large companies.
No, they do. Absolutely.
So I guess one final question
Yeah.
is, and this is, I know, right up Alex's alley. Can you share more insights on the synergies between the plastics treaty and the BB&J agreement?
I
Might
saw that question. I love this question. Yes.
delaying the signing process of one agreement impact the other? controversially, could ratifying one accelerate the signing of the other? And let me just add one more caveat is the future potential mining and minerals treaty, which is clearly impacting all of them as well.
Well, that will certainly link into, I think, of the two, much more BB&J, right?
Yes.
Much more, but it will also have impacts on plastic. I think it will be really important to think of the two of them kind of together for several reasons. First of all, the environmental will from one tends to carry over into the other. And if we see that there is an environmental will to recognize, the need to protect the AB&J, so the areas of biological or biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, then that hopefully will translate into an understanding of kind of environmental priorities that then link it to plastics. What I have seen so far in working with aspects of BB&J implementation and obviously plastics is that a lot of the groundwork for the ratification process for hopefully the plastics treaty soon is being laid by BB&J. So I know I said this at the beginning of the course, and I really will say it again. Treaties are not that common. The negotiation of a treaty is not that common. It doesn't happen that often, really, in international law. And so it is entirely possible that in governments, whether they're big states, small states, in between, you will have people who don't have any institutional memory of when they last helped get a treaty through. And they won't remember what they had to do. Did they have to know from constitutional requirements, okay, fine, the prime minister has to introduce a piece of legislation. But did they have to convene a group of ministers from each of the potentially interested ministries to talk about this first? Did they have to convene it afterwards? Did they have to do public consultations? What type of consultations did they have to do? How long did they have to do it? Um, was there a public information requirement? All of these things are things that many people don't know because they haven't had to do it. They weren't there for Paris. Institutional memory is quite quick. It goes away very easily. And then we are left with the question of how do we do it? So I've talked to many different people in different countries who are experiencing these questions with BB&J, and in some cases have kind of helped them figure out how to do it. This is really useful because then when we get to plastics, hopefully soon, we'll have a very clear understanding of what we do. This is how we do it. This is what we already did a year or two ago. So we know what to do. So that's a huge link right there. Um, the concern is always that if BB&J, for example, comes first to a country and it becomes very divisive and very much a political object, then obviously that can carry over into other negotiations that then produce environmental treaties. And obviously, plastics is different enough that there will be some new actors that won't be involved from BB&J. But there is obviously that concern. There really is. So the hope is that the ratification process shows that for BB&J, shows us the path we have to take, makes it a bit clearer for countries as to what they have to do, and then allows them to move quickly. And also they've seen at that point kind of publicly why environment is important and articulated that for the public, and people have been on board. The concern is that if it's not as easy a process, it could hold back some ratification elements or interest for plastics. So it is a very delicate balance, but it is certainly, it's a great question because they are very much interrelated. Absolutely. And for future, for mining and minerals, which if we do get a treaty on, hopefully Sheldon and I will be back working on this. Then, we'll just keep doing this as a thing, just take it on the road. Then yes, they will be all linked. They will definitely be all linked. And I think it's important also to point out that even if we see arguments in certain areas, this happened last time for BRS on rules of procedure, that don't necessarily get settled in one COP or in one negotiation session, they can carry over, and they do often carry over into the next thing that's being negotiated. So that's something else. That's why I'm happy to share the insights coming from BRS or SPP or GFC or all of them so that we can get some senses of what may be lurking for INC 5.2.
Yes. And with that, we still have a discussion. So this is not like the last laugh. This is
No, no,
just
no,
the
no, no. It's just
last
this is the last for a
lesson.
lot of people. I understand that you like your
Yes.
Saturday and it is a holiday. And I should say happy Passover, happy Easter for everybody who's celebrating and not able to attend on Saturday. But yes,
And one one last thing. I there so yes, there is a WhatsApp group. I'll share the message again. We're definitely there. I think we still need to discuss the Slack. There's just been a it's like very much prime time for us with fundraising and everything right now for INC 5.2. Um, and so yes, and yeah, hopefully see you in the web. I know we've also discussed potentially having a few mini sessions in the future before INC, and we will definitely keep you updated on that as well.
absolutely. And we're always happy to figure things out. Or even if I take the pressure off Shellen, if I just organize up like my own little thing where she comes as a guest and we all just have a chat beforehand, I could do that too, you know?
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out.
We will.
We also have so many others that can help as well.
Exactly. Yes.
All right, I will stop recording.